All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Upton. I'm the Executive Director of an Associate Research Professor here at the LSU Center for Energy Studies. Thank you for joining our webinar, and a special welcome to you who might not be familiar with CES. We're a unique research unit at LSU in that we were established by the legislature in 1982. We provide energy information and analysis that responds to the needs of the legislature, public agencies, business civic organizations, as well as the general public. The majority of our funding comes from the legislature through LSU, but we also participate in sponsored research through federal and state agencies, as well as private industry. We take pride in our diverse constituency and funding sources, which allow us to conduct analysis and facilitate meaningful conversations as a neutral and disinterested party. And that's really what we're here today to do. So we're also grateful to the CES sustaining members from across the energy value chain and from different state agencies. And we will put those here in the chat in a second. So if your organization, of course, is not on that list, we'd love for you to join our community. So today is on a topic that has generated just countless questions and many media inquiries here at CES. And that is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. In June of 2023, CES released a brief white paper titled, "What is Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage?" And we actually had the day after we released that, I think we had a record number of hits on our website, just shows the interest in this. And that was really written in an informal way to kind of provide that foundational information to a non-technical audience. And again, we're going to put that in the chat here. About a year ago, Louisiana received primacy for Class 6 injection wells. More technically, the U.S. EPA approved the state's application to assume primacy enforcement authority over these wells, which are used for geological sequestration of carbon dioxide. The EPA's final rule was signed in December of 2023 and then took into effect in February of 2024. And this means that the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, which we have two representatives here today, I'm going to introduce, now oversees the permitting and regulation for Class 6 wells. Louisiana was the third state to receive this, following North Dakota and Wyoming. As of today, there's somewhere in the ballpark of about 80 Class 6 well applications, around about 30 or so projects, and yet none of these have actually been approved by at this point. So some context for today's conversation, and I have Chairman Hensgens, who's walking in here as well, is, decarbonization presents both a tremendous opportunity, but also a serious challenge, honestly, for the energy sector here in Louisiana and really along the Gulf Coast more. Energy companies are under pressure from investors and companies worldwide to not only document their carbon emissions, but show that they're competitive relative to other competitors around the world. And there's kind of two strategies, if you will, that we can take, which of course the balance is probably the prudent one. The first is what I call kind of this net zero strategy, where we say, look, it doesn't matter what the cost is, we're gonna get to net zero in some time frame. If we take that strategy, what we might find is that our products are too expensive for that global marketplace. The other extreme is, I call it kind of the ostrich approach, where we put our head in the sand and we say, look, we don't want to think about this decarbonization. We want to do business as usual, as we've done for over a century now. If we take that approach, then what we might find is that other parts of the world are competitive in terms of those emissions intensity, and perhaps our market share in the long run is reduced, or our products sell at a discount to that global market. So this is really the balance that we're talking about, and CCS is kind of one of the tools in the tool chest, if you will, that could be used in the future to achieve this industrial decarbonization. So today we're really fortunate to have 6 distinguished panelists here. I'm extremely excited. Having all 6 of these people is at one time is really great. First, we have Representative Brett Geymann, who's the chair of House Natural Resources and the Environment here in the Louisiana legislature. We also have Senator Bob Hensgens, who's the chair of Senate Natural Resources Committee. And so the different bills on CCS that will be going through this session, of course, will go through those 2 committees. So we're excited to hear about that. We also have the Secretary of the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, Tyler Gray. Tyler's been involved in the Center for many years, and so it's great to have you here. We also have Stephen Giambrone. He's the Director of Pipeline Safety Division at DENR and is also the Acting Commissioner of Conservation at this time. And there will be a reorg likely this summer that we can perhaps we'll touch on a little bit. Finally, I brought in two academics onto the panel and two people that I really respect greatly. First is David Schechter, who's the chair of Petroleum Engineering Department here at LSU. David's actually recent to LSU and has just awesome research, coincidentally, on enhanced oil recovery. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. And then we have Dr. John Flake, who I've known for many years now. He's the professor of chemical engineering, actually the former department chair, and is also the associate vice president of research here at LSU. So we're going to get all of these kind of different perspectives. If you have questions during the webinar, and I hope you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A at any time. So as we're saying something, please put it in. And then we're going to really reserve time at the end to answer some of these questions. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted afterwards. And so if you ask a question, of course, that will be there later. So I'm going to start off with the most basic question there is, and I'm going to put it to Dr. Flake. John, what is carbon capture, utilization, and storage? For those that have just perhaps never heard of this before.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's a way to reduce our CO2 emissions. So the capture part of this is a chemical step where we remove CO2 from, it could be byproduct CO2 from a chemical process. It could be CO2 that's coming from a power plant, or it could even be CO2 from the air. So that's the capture part. And there's different ways to do that. And then the utilization is really about recycling that CO2. You can turn it back into chemical products that we buy every day. Things like detergents, plastics, all of these things are made out of carbon. So you can recycle that CO2. Storage is the last part. It's really, I should call it permanent storage. So most of that is sequestration, but there's a few other ways you can do this. But this is permanently putting that carbon back where it came from, under the earth, as in terms of sequestration.
Yeah.
You in there, Brett?
So now we're going to move to our two committee chairmen on both the House and Senate side to talk about perhaps what to expect this session and kind of what we're thinking moving forward. Of course, the legislative session here in Louisiana starts next week. And so there's a lot of discussion about what this could mean for CCUS. But we'll still start with Chairman Hensgens. You can give a background, and then we'll move. Hopefully the technical glitch goes away.
Good morning, everybody. Bob Hensgens, Chairman of Natural Resources Committee in the Senate side of the building. Senate District 22, I represent, I see Geymann. I represent Vermilion and Acadia parishes, pretty much the all sector of the world. And this session, the Senate is decently quiet when it comes to carbon capture. I have a placeholder bill that I had in place, but Senator Reese has a bill that I think is going to end up being a very good moderate bill on carbon capture. The House is going to be driving this train. They must have 12 bills over there in Brett's committee, and which aren't all that friendly to carbon capture and storage on that side. So I'm looking on our side to try to get Senator Reese's bill moving quickly, as quick as I can, get it over to Chairman Geymann so he can have a carbon day and he can have a grown-up bill in the House committee to go before the House bills that day. And that's kind of my theory on where we go in this session from the Senate side. Brett?
Thank you, Dr. Upton, for finally getting me into the panel. Great to be
Sorry
here.
for that.
Senator Hensgens, Chairman Hensgens is correct. I believe most of the, can everybody hear me okay? I guess it's working. I think most of the controversy is going to start on our side. In the House, we're going to hear bills on April the 30th. Our goal is to hear them all on that day. Like, we'll go into the night if we have to. We're hoping that Chairman Hensgens can get the Reese bill on our side by then. We believe we can. We've talked about trying to get that done where we can have his bill in our bills to be heard on that day also, because it fits nicely with the idea of local option, which we have several House members who have filed local option bills. Those those are going to be challenging at best. I don't know how nice or of a word I could put on that. Those bills are going to be challenging, but the people want that. They want to have that discussion. We're going to have that discussion. We'll be hearing bills on expropriation for CO2 pipelines. We have bills on safety, revenue, and other topics that you're hearing from the community, from the communities that have opposition to these projects. With the help of Dr. Upton and others, we have met with many of the outside groups that have opposition to these projects, and we've provided education and answered a lot of questions about groundwater and monitoring wells. Secretary Gray came to a meeting with us. We met for, I don't know what, 4 hours or something with people, and talked about the monitoring wells, how the permit process works. And I think we did a really good job at getting good information out into the communities. And I don't see those issues popping up as much anymore, but there's still a lot of opposition to these projects they're just dug in. And so we're going to do our best to hear those concerns and address the ones that we can, and let the people have their voice be heard, and we'll see what happens. But it's going to be a wild ride on April the 30th when we hear all these bills in our committee.
So if the timeline works, I plan on having a Natural Resource Committee meeting on Tuesday of next week to move that bill to the Senate floor early on the next week, so Chairman Geymann can have it by the 30th. And I would hope a Senate bill would come up first in that committee meeting that day, so Mike wouldn't have to wait till midnight to get the rest of the bills heard. So Brett, we're gonna move Mike early.
Yeah, well, good. We and for those of you who don't know, Senator Hensgens and I work closely together on all of these issues, and we're doing our best to give the people a voice and address as many of the concerns as we can and balance those needs with industry.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much. So now we're going to switch over to Secretary Gray. Secretary Gray, can you just talk a little bit about what is Class 6? What is primacy? How does that process work?
For sure. Again, thank you very much for having us here today, and appreciate Senator Hensgens and Representative Geymann helping us communicate issues and getting questions answered back to the community. Again, being a complicated process, just to even start with your initial question about what is primacy, this is one of those issues where you have a lot of technical terms that define and describe what's happening, and it can be a challenge to truly understand what's going on. And so to give a little bit of a background on Class 6 primacy and then the Class 6 itself, Class 6 wells are a category of underground injection wells regulated under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, which are designed specifically for the geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide. Louisiana pursued primacy to administer its own Class 6 program, meaning the state, rather than the EPA, issues permits, monitors wells, and ensures compliance once the EPA approves. The reason Louisiana sought primacy is because we actually have primacy for Class 1, 2, 3, and 5 wells. Class 4 is actually the storage of nuclear waste underground, and it is prohibited by law at this time. So we skipped that Class 4. And we've had that since 1982. Been permitting wells Class 1, 2, and 3 for a long time. And then 5 is more of a, it's a middle ground, an area catch-all for wells to be drilled. But in seeking that primacy, the state had to demonstrate it had rules that were at least as stringent or strict as the federal standards, along with adequate legal and technical capacity to run the program. So the role or the development is the Louisiana's Office of Conservation, which is in the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, proposed or updated rules to align with state law, EPA's Class 6 regulations. The draft rules are then published in the Louisiana Register, and then you have a comment period that goes through, and eventually we were given that primacy designation in February of 2024. One of the issues to come back to that Senator Hensgens and Representative Geymann brought up, which is how do you communicate these issues to the community? So there are two types of public engagement processes in which you can weigh in and make comments on proposed permits or any sort of action by the agency. You have public notice and public hearings. These are administrative processes in which you would submit comments focused on the actual technical analysis of the permit itself. DENR has actually also been engaged in public meetings. Public meetings are where you have a more broad application where you want to be able to answer questions from any constituent that's interested to understand the process. Given the technology has a very narrow niche, and there is a lot of concern voiced by some of the communities in which this is being developed, we have tried to have more public meetings in order to be engaged, like Representative Geymann referenced, in answering questions on constituents. And so as we go through that process, we continue to have to be reviewed and update the program as it relates to the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. They actually review our program on an annual basis. I believe that Stephen will talk a little bit here about some of the experiences he's had, but he has a lot of experience dealing with the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration within Department of Transportation, which is also a federal program that we are reviewed on a regular basis. And so when can local communities provide input through the process? So when you see those public notices that come into the Louisiana Register, which can be found on the Division of Administration's website, as well as our website, which is www.dnr.gov. And you will see a button on the website that speaks specifically to carbon sequestration or Class 6 wells. Once you see those comment notices put out there, what you would then do is submit written or attend the public hearing, and you would make comments on the record. Those comments are recorded. There's a transcript that's established, and you have opportunities to continue to be engaged on what that application looks like. Further, those application materials, or any application that's made, you still have an opportunity to investigate and inspect those application materials. And again, the main point to make through this process is that we want to be a resource for those that are interested in learning more about it. You can visit our website. You can also call our office, and we have a process in which we would provide public information through our Director of Communication, Patrick Kurej, and his phone number is 225-342-2710. We are more than available to answer questions from communities, constituents, or whoever else might be out there. But ultimately, we want to be able to safely permit processes so that way carbon dioxide can be stored in multiple different ways, whether it's through direct air capture, which is more where they're taking the CO2 out of the air, whether it's through the commercialization of natural gas, which is the product that as it's produced out of the ground, normal natural gas, you would take that CO2 that's produced in that process down the line, or through the natural liquefaction of LNG of that natural gas, you create a pure CO2 stream, which is then injected into the ground. Each application is unique in the project that they have proposed. However, the entire purpose is to protect the underground source of drinking water. So as you're going through this process, that is the primary reason that we are reviewing these operations and these permitted activities, protect the USDW, that underground source of drinking water, so that CO2 can be safely sequestered and stored in permanence under the ground. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Secretary Gray. So what we just talked about was the sequestration itself, the Class 6 well, at least most of that. Now we're going to really switch to the transportation of that carbon dioxide with Stephen Giambrone. So, Stephen, one of the issues that, look, you and I have talked about and has been talked about a lot in the public is the unfortunate incident that happened in Satartia, Mississippi. Of course, the Denbury line, which also runs through Louisiana and has been here for decades, transports carbon dioxide. And there was an event that happened there, a big rain event, and created a rupture in that pipeline, which had obviously impacts on the people around those. Can you talk about this from a pipeline safety standpoint? What's your thoughts on pipeline safety? How is that regulated? And just really any background info regarding that.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And again, thank you for the opportunity to address folks and to be able to talk to them about pipeline safety and what we do. I want to start off by saying I was a member of API's 1185 committee, which was, we put together a recommended practice on public engagement. So I'm very proud of that document. It's relatively new. We're encouraging our operators to utilize that document. And so this is part of engagement, right? Our operators have had regulations in place for years on public awareness, and I'm making the public aware of pipelines that are in their communities and the products and how to identify a leak and what to do and who to call and who to contact. But this newest document from API on engagement is all about engaging, right? Not just making folks aware, but having communications with folks, addressing their concerns, listening to their concerns, having almost a partnership on pipeline development and operations with the communities that they're involved in. So so it's great to be able to participate in these kinds of events. And so the Satarsha incident, Denbury CO2 pipeline, though that line in particular is regulated by PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is under the U.S. Department of Transportation. They regulate all interstate pipelines carrying hazardous materials and CO2. The state of Louisiana, through a certification with U.S. Department of Transportation, regulates the intrastate pipelines in Louisiana, whether they're gases that are toxic, corrosive, or flammable, or those products defined as hazardous liquids and CO2 covered under Title 49, Part 195. And so we do that starting with design and construction. When we're talking about 195 materials and all pipeline materials that are used, not just the pipe itself, but valves and other instruments on the pipe all have to be compatible with the material that's going to transport. That's kind of the first step of design. And then, of course, the pipe has to be such a thickness and strength that it can operate at certain pressures to be able to move the product, right? There are all kinds of qualifications for personnel who are constructing that pipeline, in particular the welders who have to have welding qualifications. Everyone has to be qualified for purposes of coding, for excavation, for any work. Anybody who touches that pipeline is qualified under a program to touch that pipeline. At the end of the construction phase, that pipeline gets pressure tested to ensure it can withstand the pressures that it will see during operations. And then through operations and maintenance, there are all kinds of requirements in the code that they have to follow in terms of their normal maintenance of a pipeline. And we regulate all that, right? We're here to ensure that operators are following the code, which is the minimum standards. Many operators will go above and beyond the minimum standards. But our program is an inspection and enforcement program. It's not a permitting program. Okay, we don't permit pipelines. If you need to cross a highway, you go get a permit from the highway department. If you need to go through a wetlands area, you go through the Office of Coastal Management or the Corps of Engineers, Wildlife. There may be other agencies that handle permitting. What we handle is safety, and our focus is integrity of the pipeline. And so we have agents who live across the state, who have not only internal training to do these audits, but also we get training from the federal government. We take classes, which are not just in the classroom, but also out in the field, which we all have to pass in order to be qualified to perform these audits. And so we inspect from the construction phase through the operations and maintenance, all the way through the abandonment at the end of the useful life of that piece of pipe, to make sure it's abandoned properly, such that no product is left in that pipeline that could be hazardous to the public. And so our focus for the most part is on pipeline integrity, right? But we know that pipelines do have releases. And so there's also regulations in place for what to do if you have a release, right? So all operators have an emergency response plan for dealing with emergencies, for training their personnel to deal with emergencies, for liaisoning, having liaisons with the local fire departments and other emergency response personnel. They do tabletop exercises, they do drills. They have to review their emergency manuals once a year and update them, look for gaps. If they happen to have a release, there's an investigation after the fact to determine a root cause. We will come in also and investigate and see if any violations may have led to that release, right? So we may issue citations sometimes if it was operator error that contributed to the causes. And so there's a continual evaluation of our programs that operators have to do to look for gaps or look for errors, and then make continual improvements. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell. You know, I'm happy to answer any questions on our program and how it works. I could talk all day about, you know, everything that we do, but I want to be respectful of other people's time. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Stephen. We really appreciate that. So now we're gonna switch gears to our two academics on the panel. We're gonna start with Dr. Schechter, who I mentioned is the chair of petroleum engineering and has done a lot of work on enhanced oil recovery. And one of the things that I think I've heard from a lot of community members, a bit of frustration, is kind of talking about CCS as if this is something that's happened for a really long time. And so there are comparisons to enhanced oil recovery, which you have a lot of research in. We had looked at about 15 active CCS projects globally that are currently operational, but that are much, much smaller scale, I think, than some of the projects that we're looking at and talking about today and a lot of the permits that have been applied for. So Dr. Schechter, can you talk a little bit about how are these comparisons reasonable? How is perhaps it very different now? And give some context on what is the CCS we're talking about moving forward versus what is stuff that the industry has done historically.
Oh, thank you, Greg. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Both CCS and CO2 EOR both require subsurface injection of CO2. And so you're injecting into porous media that is several thousand feet deep, and you're storing that in underground rock formations. And these storage mechanisms are similar. Both are trapped either structurally or stratigraphically. Both exist as residual fluids in the pore space. Both have solubility trapping, meaning that the CO2 either mixes with the oil or it mixes with the water. And then there is the possibility for long-term mineral trapping if there's a reactive rock that is being injected into. Both technologies require compression. Both require injection wells, although the CO2 EOR injection wells are class 2 and the CCS wells are class 6. And both require monitoring. Monitoring in the case of CO2 EOR, you want to know where the CO2 is going, and you want to know where the plume is moving to, just like you would in a CCS case. And the potential for incidental storage is also a similarity between the two. For CCS, you want to store it over some geologic time, whereas for CO2 EOR, you inject CO2. And when you inject anything in an oil field, whether it's water, CO2, or any other agent, you will produce it. And so in the case of CO2 EOR, you inject CO2, and then you will produce a fraction of that. So for instance, there is a CO2 EOR flood just east of Baton Rouge, where about 75 billion cubic feet have been retained or stored in the reservoir, whereas the total cumulative injection since 2008 has been about 400 BCF. So about 20% of the CO2 has been retained or stored in this reservoir where you're actually enhancing oil recovery. So some of the key differences are the purpose. You know, the purpose for CCS is climate mitigation and reducing the net CO2 in the atmosphere. Whereas for CO2 enhanced oil recovery, what you're trying to do is make more oil, increase oil production, and in that case, the revenue is from that oil production. We've already discussed how the regulatory class of the wells is different between class 2 and class 6. And then in CO2 carbon capture, most of the CO2 will be anthropogenic, meaning man-made or generated CO2. Whereas in CO2 EOR, most of the CO2 being injected for enhanced oil recovery is natural CO2. In the case of the flood east of Baton Rouge, that CO2 is sourced from Jackson Dome in Mississippi, which is a natural CO2 source. And then often the CO2 accounting is different. So you can count CCS towards emissions reduction, whereas it's not counted in CO2 EOR unless that storage is proven. And then the revenue model is very different. The revenue model for CCS is based on 45Q tax credits, whereas the revenue for CO2 EOR is based on oil sales. And then the net carbon effect. is negative if it's permanent and verifiable in CCS type of projects, whereas it's net neutral or positive unless the storage exceeds the emissions from the oil that is being produced from a CO2 EOR project. Monitoring is different as well. In the case of CCS, you need long-term monitoring, 50 plus years. And in CO2 EOR, it's more short-term monitoring. You want to know where the CO2 moves, but eventually the CO2 flood presumably will be abandoned. Although I might add, in particular CO2 floods, they tend to be very long-lasting. As a matter of fact, the oldest CO2 EOR flood in the domestic U.S. or the world for that matter is Kelly Snyder Field or Sack Rock in West Texas, and that has been under flood since 1972, and it's still under flood. So most of these CO2 floods are very long lasting, and abandonment is not very prevalent up to this point. And then the public perception is very different. It's seen as a climate tool for CCS, whereas CO2 EOR is simply seen as increasing the production of oil.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. So now I'm going to switch to Dr. Flake, and I think something that's not talked about as much is the U in CCUS. We talk a lot about the sequestration or other forms of storage actually as well, but what about that utilization? Can you talk a little bit more about that and what kind of opportunities there could be for using carbon dioxide for other purposes that we use?
Yeah, so I should start by saying, personally, I don't like the word decarbonization. I don't think it's a bad element. I mean, we're made out of carbon. And so we're all part of the carbon cycle, the natural carbon cycle. The big difference is what I call the short cycle or the long cycle. So the short cycle is something on the order of 100 years. The long cycle involves fossil fuels, and that's something on the order of 100 million years. So if you do utilization, you can take CO2 that we created and use that as a building block to, produce the chemicals that we make. In Louisiana, we're a world leader in carbon-based chemicals. We make tons of ethylene, tons of methanol, tons of urethanes, all kind of different chemical products. And those are based in carbon. Right now, a lot of those come from fossil fuels, but we can make those from CO2. And so all of this recovery, these pipelines give you more, a greater feedstock for CO2. One big example is methanol. Methanol, you can start with CO2 to make methanol. We make Methanex here in Louisiana, it's one of the world leaders in methanol production. But right now they use a lot of CO2 from that same Jackson Dome that Dr. Schechter mentioned. But you can use CO2 that comes from that you captured at another plant down the road to be able to convert that into methanol. And it is a little bit more expensive, but it has a lower carbon intensity. And so over time, I think you're going to start looking at things. It's not, it reminds me of looking at the calorie count for food. You won't just consume products blindly around the world. I think people will look as, well, what was the carbon intensity of that? And that's part of this competitiveness argument. So with recycling or utilization, you can really lower the carbon intensity. So in some cases, you can even make it negative. If you do direct air capture, you actually have a carbon negative product. So there's lots of opportunities for utilization. Of course, there's way too much CO2 to utilize it all. And so you sort of have to balance this between sequestration and utilization if you want to make an impact.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and we've got tons of other questions pouring in on the Q&A, so please continue to put those in. But this one's really on, so I'm an economist by background, and I think of things in terms of risk. We take risks every day. Of course, we get in our cars and drive. That's a risk, but arguably that's a risk that we're deciding to take as individuals. But we've also built out a lot of infrastructure in this country. We can give the example that happened with the large fire in California that started from a transmission line that, of course, the huge lawsuit over that. We've had other environmental disasters here. We mentioned the Satartia incident. We've of course had, releases in the oil and gas sector. And so my question is really around how do we think about the risks of CCUS, again, from the capture to the transportation to the storage, relative to other risks that we've decided as a society to take by building out infrastructure. And so I'll really punt this to, and of course all of you can opine, but perhaps Dr. Schechter, you could probably talk about the sequestration piece of it the best. Commissioner Giambrone, probably the transport piece, and then Dr. Flake in terms of in the facility itself, the capture piece. So I'll let y'all go in whatever order you want, but can you talk about that? How do you think about that risk?
Well, the capture risk is moderate compared to other technologies. For instance, in CO2 EOR, there's a very low technical risk. It's a proven technology and it's widely applied, and where it has been applied, it's been successful, and it's been a very good technology. However, for CCS, just the long-term storage bumps this up to a slightly moderate risk because we haven't really done that yet. And so we don't know if the seal integrity or the ability to stratigraphically trap and hold CO2 for long periods of time, how feasible that is. In my opinion, it's just a matter of, at the end of the day, pressure. If you have a reservoir that is under pressure and you inject CO2 and you build pressure up back to the original pressure, then you're not going to risk the integrity of any of the nearby rocks that would cause leaks to the surface. However, long-term storage requires a lot of CO2 being injected over a very long period of time. And depending on what that pressure buildup is, or that ability to disperse the pressure over a large distance, would eventually make that more of a moderate risk. For instance, in Louisiana, the aquifers that we're considering injecting into are extensive, very extensive, but we don't know what the pressure response would be as we start injecting CO2 and moving that water around. So if there's a large pressure response, that means it's a small container, and that would up the risk. Whereas if it's a large container and you move water over very large distances and the pressure doesn't increase, then the seal integrity and the ability to store that for a very long period of time is similar to storing the salty water that has been there for geologic time. So that's the moderate risk I see, is just the ability to not pressure up a storage container.
And that sounds like you need to do the Class 6 permitting process correctly and really do the engineering right.
Have to test it. That's correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Commissioner Giambrone, do you want to go next, perhaps, on the kind of how do you think about the risk of CO2 pipelines?
Sure.
You, of course, monitor and think of the safety of lots of pipelines. Just yesterday, we were in the hydrogen task force, and the talk was actually on the safety of hydrogen pipelines. I don't want you to compare specifically to hydrogen, but the idea of how do you think about the risk of CO2 relative to all the different pipelines we have in Louisiana?
Right. So in the pipeline safety code, we address risk. Operators are to assess threats to their pipeline and the hazards to the general area. Right. So all the pipeline safety code is based on risk, essentially, to where we even define high consequence areas. And in high consequence areas, operators have to have integrity management programs. But a lot of operators will treat the entirety of their pipeline system as a high consequence area. And so what they have to do is, through all this data that we collect on a pipeline, or that the operators collect on a pipeline, through all their maintenance tasks, they will identify what's the greatest risk to the integrity of my pipeline. And they will have to be proactive in their measures to addressing those risks. Let's say that they're seeing some corrosion on their pipe. Pipeline operators run smart tools through their pipe, which essentially take an X-ray of their pipeline, and they can see corrosion, they can see cracks, dents, anomalies, potential coating issues with their pipe. And let's say that a particular area of their pipeline is having some corrosion on it, right? So operators may see that as a threat to the integrity of their pipe and take additional measures through corrosion. Maybe they go in and they recoat the pipe. Maybe they will examine that pipe on a greater frequency for corrosion, such that at a certain point they will determine, okay, even though the set isn't leaking, we're not going to wait for a leak. We're going to go ahead and replace the pipe right now because we see that we have a corrosion problem in this area. Maybe we're going to step up our patrols in this area. Pipeline operators have to patrol their pipelines at least 26 times a year, not to exceed, I think, 3 weeks. Maybe we're going to patrol once a week to look for signs of a potential leak in the area. So operators are always thinking about risks to their pipe, and they're compelled to do that by the code. You know, they have to do it. But operators, even in those areas that aren't necessarily considered high consequence, because maybe they're out in areas where we don't have inhabit, you know, buildings and homes. Perhaps they're not areas that we would consider to be unusually sensitive areas in terms of environment, but they implement these programs all the same. Because operators don't want to have leaks, right? I mean, leaks are, you know, besides the safety, I mean, let's just even take the safety out. They cost money. You know, they don't want to, you know, they don't want to lose that product. That product is valuable. They want to move that product. So even if we took the safety aspect, which is why we do what we do, it still is, you know, there's a cost there to the operator. And so a lot of these preventative measures that they will take in the long run, not only do they enhance safety, but they save operators money by you know, taking care of defects in their pipe before they become a problem. And that's part of what all the training that they do. That's why everyone has to be qualified to do work and know how to operate pipelines properly, is to limit the risk, right? Every company wants to limit its risk, wants to limit its exposure. And so we think about risk all the time in the pipeline world, and whether it's hazardous liquid, CO2, natural gas, hydrogen, all operators are compelled by the code to consider risk.
So can I push you a little bit more on that? And if you're
Sure.
comfortable answering it in terms of
Absolutely.
where does CO2 pipelines fit into that spectrum? Is that on the high risk end of the pipelines? Is it on the low? Is it the medium? Are you comfortable
Well,
thinking
no,
of,
I'm not uncomfortable talking, you know,
yeah.
compared to the, so the state of Louisiana has, I don't know, 300 miles of CO2 pipe. We have 70,000 miles of natural gas pipe, you know, so where does CO2 fit into a risk compared to natural gas? Well, we just have so much more. You know, I know we
Kind
had a
of
report
on a mile per mile basis.
mile per mile. I would say it's probably less in terms of releases. You know, I know Denbury did have a release on a pipeline, what, a year or two ago. It was an equipment malfunction at a station. So you know, I don't know the numbers on, and we do actually track incidents per 1,000 miles of pipe. For our program, we do look at that. It's a number I could look at, but I would say, you know, there are very few, I'm gonna say, reportable accidents, and we have a definition of what a reportable accident is. It's any release of over 5 gallons. That's not unintentional. If anyone is hospitalized, meaning staying overnight at a hospital, right, for treatment, or a death, obviously, and then a certain cost. I think right now the cost is still $50,000 for hazardous liquids. If the cost of the release and repair exceeds a certain amount, a monetary amount, it becomes reportable, and that's where we come in and actually do a full-blown investigation of the release. What's the root cause? You know, what contributed to it? Or any operator action or inaction did that contribute to the incident? So in terms of how safe are CO2 pipelines, you know, they're such a small portion of the pipeline network. It's hard to really compare them to the 4,000 miles of highly volatile liquid lines that we regulate here that are intrastate, you know, not just the interstate pipe. So it's hard to really make comparisons when it's really a small sample of the pipelines in this state.
That's helpful. Thank you. And
Sure.
we're going to go to Dr. Flake. If you could do this in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, that would be awesome. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and we got lots pouring in. So
Sure.
in terms of safety and the kind of in the confines of the fence line, how do you think about capture relative to the other technologies?
Sure. So, you know, safety is really the paramount concern whenever you're talking about either the design phase or the operation phase of one of these capture units. If you go to a typical chemical plant around here, you'll find, 5 or 6 different units. You can think of this as just one additional unit. But in there from the design phase, all of that equipment has been designed for the pressures and temperatures in mind that you're using. And then from the operation phase, there's a risk-based process safety program that you go through, and you look at the frequency or the likelihood, and you look at the intensity, and you can design to mitigate all of those risks. You ask a little bit about the relative risk. So we make a lot of chemicals in Louisiana, a lot of ethylene, MDI, TDI, ammonia, refrigerants. On the relative scale, this is, I perceive it as relatively low. It's not flammable. You're really dealing with pressure mostly. Temperature is you've got to do some stripping here. But in a relative sense, it's well designed, well operated. It's something that's chemical engineers do really well.
That's helpful. All right, so now we're going to go into questions, and we got a lot, so I'm going to try to categorize them. This first one I think is for Secretary Gray and the 2 committee chairmen. And there's questions on Representative McCormick has a bill to just ban carbon sequestration outright in Louisiana. There are other bills to have these local options where an individual parish could opt out. Of course, we build a lot of infrastructure in this country, and there's federal regulations, there's state regulations, there's local regulations. And so there's importance of understanding kind of the level of that fits in for consistency and to move forward with infrastructure. But there's also the importance of having local communities, having a say of what's in their community. Can y'all opine on this? Perhaps give some perspective and your thoughts on how we achieve that balance, both in terms of listening to the communities, but also in terms of understanding what these regulatory regimes are. Do you want to start, Secretary Gray?
Sure. And I just wanted to say, I know there have been a couple of questions in the chat, just to make sure that some of the technical ones get answered. I've tried to answer them on the side, especially as it relates to the regulations.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, and I think everyone should be able to see those, so thank you.
For sure. I mean, I think it really comes down to a balance. And I think that, Stephen has done a great job of sort of breaking down that balance from the risks that come through that analysis. But, we are under, like, the program itself is subject to the EPA scrutiny. So it's important that we comply to be at least as strict as those regulations. Local options in the state of Louisiana have been under and debated for over a century. In fact, the Commissioner of Conservation has in the law a preemption of oil and gas operations of local options for this exact reason. This is not necessarily a new concept to be debated, but at the same time, that's why the state has been vested with the authority to oversee larger scale projects like this, is because of some of the challenges that come with local governments, the officials, the analysis that comes to make sure that it's safe, which is one of the reasons why I've tried to answer some of the questions in the side, is because the process in which we are evaluating requires a level of technical expertise that we want to have available in a central location. It's not something that everyone necessarily has access to. That being said, in the law that has come, it's still the local community's right to dictate how they want to define their jurisdiction. And so I welcome that debate. I just share that it has been something that has been in the space of debate for a long time, because it impacts local property owners, landowners, and those folks have a right to express themselves, whether through their legislative representative in the committee hearing, whatever that would be, and always happy to talk through the pros and cons of that. But again, the more layers that you add on regulation, the more intersections that you have between local, state, federal, that is complexity. That defines what makes a project hard to create, to pursue, And with that, that impacts economic activity. Again, just like we talk about risk for everything else, it's a balance. And so how do you want to balance that out? But again, the state of Louisiana is not, we are reviewing the regulations so that a proposed project could potentially come to fruition. If there are no applications for a permit, we will not issue any. They have to comply with the regulations in order to receive that permit to construct, to operate, to inject. So this is something where our role is to support and be the voice and the balance that comes with the proposal from the company and how that impacts the local areas. I know that Representative Geymann and Senator Hensgens referenced Senator Reese's bill. His proposal is that you give substantial consideration to local and elected officials within those areas. This is something that the Office of Coastal Management has used for a very long time. And it is something that we are comfortable in that analysis and process. So that way, if there are permitted operations that are designated as safe under the Safe Drinking Water Act from 1974, the well can be constructed, drilled, and permitted. It's still the local community's right to say we don't want it. And that's the balance that we are working to provide to the state.
Yeah, so Representative Geymann and Senator Hensgens, I know the three of us have talked about before this kind of, if a local, for instance, a parish says, hey, this is kind of banned here, you can't do it, that has property rights for the people that are in that parish, right? That maybe do want to lease this land out for this. Can you talk about this balance of state, federal, local regulation and how to think about that? You want to start, Representative Geymann?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Upton. And I think you just said it. You just answered the question that we have to find that balance. And to Secretary Gray's point, I think the Mike Reese bill is going to be an important part of that conversation with local option. Representative Owen has the local option bill that would apply statewide. And then various members have local option bills that are specific to a parish. And so all of these ideas are going to be discussed in public with the legislature and citizens and the authors of these bills. And so that's why we have committee hearings, so that we can have that debate. And Secretary Gray, I'm sure, will be there to weigh in his thoughts as well. And we'll see where that goes. But I think the challenge for Senator Hensgens and I is, how do we find that balance? And that's a heavy lift on this particular topic. But we're all doing the very best we can to do that and to strike that balance and to make sure that the locals, as Secretary Gray said, have some input. Because ultimately, they're the ones that live with, whether it's moderate risk or minimum risk, they live with that. And so the locals also have to find balance between the revenue, whatever job creations may be there, and then the risk they're going to assume from those projects. And so it's a challenge for all of us, but that's why we have a legislature and a committee process. And we're going to hear these bills, and they're going to get a fair hearing, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with Chairman Geymann. This is going to be that balance thing: economics, local issues. Every one of these bills are going to get a fair hearing. Every one of them are going to be able to learn a lot while we listen to these bills. And I don't think Brett or I are in a spot right now to call the balls and the strikes. We're just going to listen and see how it goes during those committee meetings. Everyone filed one of those bills with the issue in mind. And we're going to hear them out and try to find that special spot that we can get it done right. And that's what committees are about. And I look forward to the hearings.
Awesome. Yeah. So here's another good question that I've heard a lot. I don't know, maybe Secretary Gray could opine and Dr. Schechter on this. And of course, anyone can hop in. But there's discussion of sequestration in areas that have historically had depleted reservoirs of oil and gas versus areas that have not had historical oil and gas presence. Perhaps they haven't had the wells drilled there. Perhaps they've got more storage space. What are y'all seeing, and what are you thinking about? Are these going to typically go to areas that are depleted oil and gas reservoirs, or other areas, or maybe it's a balance of the two?
Well, let me try to field that one.
Yeah, that's great.
First of all, CO2 is created as a post-combustion process for the most part. So it's thermodynamically unfavorable to reuse CO2. It requires a lot of energy. So if you look at all the CO2 that's produced in the world, which is 40 billion metric tons per year, then trying to reuse that is going to be difficult in the utilization sense. That makes it even more important that we do CCS. And a tag on of that is storage in oil reservoirs for enhanced oil recovery, which the state of Louisiana should be aggressively pursuing because Louisiana's oil production is dropping, and this is a way to increase the oil production. So there's a very good fit for using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And as far as gas reservoirs are concerned, there was a question regarding storage in depleted gas reservoirs. That's an excellent idea. They're proven traps. We know the geology. We've logged it. We've mapped it. There's an existing infrastructure. We know the wells exist and we can reuse them. The pipelines are usually in place, and you get a high storage efficiency because methane or some hydrocarbon gas has been stored for geologic time in these type of reservoirs. So the reuse is an important aspect of this, the utilization, and we want to aggressively pursue that. But keep in mind, that's only going to account for a small fraction of the CO2 that is currently emitted in the US. And so because of that, we should be aggressively pursuing CCS and CO2 EOR, and also storage of CO2 in depleted gas reservoirs.
Thanks. Secretary Gray, do you want to, or I don't know, maybe you're at liberty or not to talk about, generally speaking, the applications that are out there and what you're seeing, depleted oil and gas reservoirs versus just kind of new areas?
So a depleted oil and gas reservoir is very different than, some of the other designs that you would have for trapping CO2. And the reason I say it in that manner, because we've been storing natural gas for a long time in depleted reservoirs. I think they're like almost 300 in the state of Louisiana. I'm going off memory, but it's like 273. The difference between storing natural gas and CO2 is the process in which you are evaluating an underground injection control class 6 well. Is you have
10 o'clock.
You have to review and ensure that there's limitations of artificial penetrations or well bores that may penetrate the zone in which you're storing. And so inherently a depleted reservoir is an oil and gas well. So typically in areas like that, you'll have multiple different wells. And when you have a lot of different wells and they're not plugged to a CO2 resistant standard, it's a harder project to develop as an applicant. So typically it's kind of why you see the other direction, where you see fewer depleted reservoirs or zones as part of those applications, because at this time, the economics rely on limitations of artificial penetrations into the relevant zones. And so maybe at one point in the future, there becomes some way that all wells are CO2 resistant, which is why the department is actually working on beefing up our orphan well and abandoned well program to plug them to a standard in which CO2 resistant materials are used, which makes the state more economically viable with fewer. Not only is it an environmental benefit, but it's a statewide economic benefit. So simultaneously trying to keep that orphan well program, at max capacity based on what production is and feed covering and things like that. But at the same time, the reservoirs might be a little bit further down the line, because primarily you're looking at undeveloped zones, in my opinion, that would be more viable. And so the applicant that we have sent to public comment now is for a hackberry project, which is in Cameron Parish. It's out for public comment now. The public hearing, I believe, is May 5th. And so they're receiving comments now to talk about what that would look like. Again, the permit is the CO2 source is proposed to come from Cameron LNG, which is currently exporting natural gas. The process in which that liquefaction happens, the pure CO2 stream is piped, transported over to the injection zone, and then sequestered for permanence. But again,
Awesome.
That's the only one that's come out to date. The rest of them, there are proprietary restrictions to be able to talk about it. It's actually nice going into the legislative session to talk about a viable project that's actually not necessarily built on credits, but on an existing product that's already being exported. You're adding that value add layer to the project in LNG itself. So it's a good project to be able to talk about.
Awesome. So we're 2 minutes over, but I'm going to take the liberty as the chair here to ask one final question. And it's going to be for our two chairmen. So we had and the question in here is really about local benefits of these projects, especially in the sequestration location. So there's been a lot of talk, even at the very front, I talked about industrial decarbonization and what that could mean for our state. And those industrial facilities are really concentrated along the river and these, very specific areas, while the sequestration locations are oftentimes in other areas, perhaps more rural communities. And so there's been a legitimate question by these local communities of, okay, you're doing the sequestration here. What are the benefits for my local community? We had a few months ago the emergency rule from the Louisiana Tax Commission, and that's legal verbiage, but essentially it's the temporary rule on how the sequestration wells will be assessed for property tax. And we've done an analysis of that, and there's really not a lot. It might be a few $100s a property tax from one of these wells. There's discussion of maybe having a sequestration fee similar to a severance tax, but of course there's also the property tax for the equipment at the surface. Can y'all talk a little bit about local revenues and perhaps what we might expect with that this session? Would you like to start, Chairman Geymann?
Sure. I think what we're hearing the most about, Dr. Upton, would be an injection tax.
Okay.
An injection fee, whatever, on the project. And of course, the discussion is that revenue going to be distributed among the lease, of the storage area, and instead of just where the injection is taking place. And those are questions we're going to have to get answered through the legislative process. But I think that Senator Hensgens and I would want to see the best distribution of that revenue to the locals as possible. What that's going to look like as far as whether it's an injection tax or not, that just seems to be what I'm hearing on our side about the most viable plan is to have some sort of a tax at injection.
Yeah, and of course, taxes can't start on the Senate side, but that's what we're hearing too. I mean, we do hear from the locals, right?
Mhm.
If you're got the 45Q taxes in Plaquemine, but you stored it in Vermilion Parish, what did Vermilion Parish get off of it?
Mhm.
Besides the storage,
Right.
almost nothing at the moment. And we need to find a way to balance that out to do it. And I think the injection tax is probably how we're going to go.
Awesome. Well, look, we are 5 minutes over. We've got tons of questions. I apologize for those we couldn't get to, but I want to thank our panelists so much to get these 6 very busy people just days before the legislative session to start is just really awesome. So thank you so much for this. And we'll see everyone soon. Thank y'all.